You're invited to this year's Scott Joplin Jazzy Birthday Celebration, Saturday, November 27th at the 1923 Banana Club. Proceeds go to the Music in the Air Rooftop Artworks Project. Dance to live jazz music and prizes, too, for the best speakeasy costume. Table reservations and tickets at 903-490-5471 or donation at the door. Sponsored by Mikey and Pete Mankins, the Patterson-Troike Foundation, Main Street Texarkana, the Texarkana Gazette, and Jay Brown for the home.
Hello and welcome to On the Line. I'm Karl Richter. Lynn LaRowe's name is very familiar to Texarkana Gazette readers. As the Gazette's longtime legal affairs reporter, Lynn has covered the biggest local crime stories of the last 15 years, as well as hundreds of other cases and lawsuits. For this week's episode, I spoke with her about her career, how she does her work, and the insights it has given her. And she previewed some of the stories she is working on now. Here's my conversation with Lynn LaRowe. Welcome to the studio. Thanks for taking the time. I'm sure you're super busy. Do courts slow down this time of year?
Well, they do slow down a little bit for about a week, but then they'll pick right back up again at a fever pace until, about a week or so before Christmas. And then there'll be about 2 weeks of dead time between kind of the Christmas and New Year's. You kind of get a little slowdown in there when people are taking time off to be with their families.
So just for people who may not know, tell us what you do. What do you cover?
Well, I am the legal news reporter for the Texarkana Gazette, so I cover anything that has to do with the courts. So that includes pretty much the whole of the criminal justice system, probation included with that, prosecutions, defense, all of those kinds of things, as well as any sort of civil court filings. We don't cover things like divorces or custody disputes, but we do cover, civil lawsuits that might be over contracts or medical malpractice or some other type of tort, which is a fancy word for wrongdoing. Mm-hmm. So anything that has to do with the legal system.
And how long have you been doing this?
A little over 15 years.
How did you get into this profession?
Well, largely by accident. I started out many, many years ago with a bachelor's degree and worked as a counselor in a battered women's shelter. I've worked as a counselor in different women's clinics in both Dallas and Austin, and as a probation officer for the state of Texas, specifically for Travis County, Texas, which is Austin, and supervised probationers for about 5.5, 6 years. And then I went to work for the state of Texas, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, as a trainer. And I used to travel around the state and train probation officers in all Texas counties. I took some time off and had some wonderful children, and then decided I wanted to go back to work. And I responded to an ad that was in the back of the Texarkana Gazette for someone to write copy for advertisements. And I interviewed with one of our illustrious city editors, Christy Busby, and when we were finished, she offered me the opportunity to write straight news stories on a contract basis. And I did that for a little while, and then she brought me on full-time. And about 6 weeks after that, they moved me into the legal news reporting position, and I've been doing it ever since.
I'm sure one thing that people are curious about is how you choose which cases to cover. I mean, we can't cover them all, obviously. So how do you make those decisions?
Well, there's a lot of different factors that come into play. Sometimes it might be because it is a politician, somebody, an elected official charged with a crime. And we'll cover those typically, if it's misdemeanors or felonies. Don't cover a whole lot of misdemeanor cases, but, there's always an exception in there somewhere when, if there's some compelling reason why we think that our readers might want to know about it. But obviously things like capital murder and murder, we are going to cover those cases from start to finish because there is obviously a, public interest in knowing how those filings or, cases are resolved. Other things like a civil lawsuit pertaining to, say, the Tony Alamo case that we had back here, in like 2008 and 2009. That was a criminal case in federal court initially where Alamo was charged with, bringing young girls across state lines for sex. He married girls as young as 8 years old. But then later on, a lot of the victims sued him in civil court and won large judgments against him in the state of Arkansas and in federal court, both boys and girls, men and women. So sometimes they overlap, the civil and the criminal, but largely it's those really big crimes like murder, capital murder, sexual assault of a child, continuous sexual abuse of a child. We certainly want to make our readers aware of who the dangerous people may be walking around among them in their community. Guys standing next to you in the grocery store might be a sex offender. So sometimes when those really big cases get filed, we certainly cover those.
You mentioned the Tony Alamo case. Was that the first really big case you covered? What was the first
that I
one?
can recall? I mean, I know there were some others prior to that, but I hadn't actually been writing for the Gazette for that long when that happened. I know the raid was like September the 8th.
Now, let's just remind people what that case was all about.
Sure. Tony Alamo was a cult leader who had a big compound out here in Fouke, Arkansas, which of course is, just up the road from Texarkana. He also had properties in other places in Arkansas as well as in Oklahoma. He'd been to federal prison previously for a tax evasion charge, but this time he was accused of violating the Mann Act, which is a federal law that makes it a crime to transport somebody across state lines for illicit purposes, including sexual activity, which is the specific conduct he was accused of. And there was a trial in 2009. A jury in the Western District of Arkansas convicted him of all 10 counts listed in an indictment accusing him of bringing 5 young girls across state lines for sex, although there were other victims who certainly testified against him at trial that weren't even named in the indictment. So it was a big case, and the trial lasted a couple of weeks, and then months after the conviction, he was sentenced by he's now the late U.S. District Judge Harry Barnes sentenced him to 150 years in prison. A life sentence essentially. And then after that, there were, of course, civil proceedings, a civil lawsuit filed by Texarkana lawyer David Carter actually resulted eventually in the seizure of a lot of those properties up in the Fouke area, and those were auctioned off, and the proceeds were used to pay those large civil judgments that victims of Tony Alamo's were awarded. It was an interesting case. That cult was generations old. There were people who had been born and raised in that group that had never known any other world. And so it was very difficult for people to leave. And when they left, they had absolutely nothing but the clothes on their back and the shoes on their feet.
And Alamo died in prison recently, isn't that correct?
Yeah, a few years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but he passed away in a federal lockup. And
some of his followers are still out there with the same set of beliefs. Correct?
My understanding is that they have established a new compound somewhere in the Kansas area, but I'm not, 100% sure because obviously I've been kind of busy following other things, right, and there's been nothing new filed here recently. So, yeah.
What are some other big cases that stand out in your mind?
Well, I covered my very first death penalty case just a couple of years ago, and that was Billy Joel Tracy. He was already serving a life sentence in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for assaulting and brutalizing and kidnapping a young woman in the Dallas area. And he had assaulted multiple correctional officers and other inmates while incarcerated. And while at the Telford unit in New Boston, he managed to slip his hand free of the cuffs as he was being transported by correctional officer Timothy Davison from a recreation area back to his cell. He grabbed Davison's trace bar, which is a metal bar that TDC correctional officers use to manipulate the opening in cell doors to pass meal trays and other items, and lock and unlock handcuffs. And he beat him to death, and it was all captured on videotape. It was very grisly footage, and that was about a 2-week trial. And at the end of that, a Bowie County jury sentenced Billy Joel Tracy to death, and his appellate process is currently ongoing.
Are there certain kinds of crime that are more prevalent here in the Texarkana area? Do you see any patterns like that? I mean, I know a lot of people, just based on what we cover, might think, for instance, sexual abuse of children might be more prevalent here than somewhere else. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I honestly don't believe that's the case. I think it's unfortunately it happens everywhere. It crosses all socioeconomic lines. It's not a crime I can provide any explanation for. But I think it's probably the same anywhere you go. Unfortunately, I do make a point of covering those cases. As we said, we believe it's a public service to our readers. We also try to give a voice to victims as well. We've had some, other really high-profile things happen here that are unusual that you don't see that often, like the fetal abduction case that's currently pending. Mm-hmm. But I would say, too, that with respect to the sexual assault cases, I think 20 years ago, there were, just picking a number out of the air, there was still more of a stigma attached to being a sexual abuse victim or having an offender in your family. And those crimes were often not talked about. They were swept under the rug. They were stigmatized. And I think as that stigma begins to sort of go away, as more and more people come forward and discuss it, we've got the Me Too movement. I think as you lift the stigma, people are more inclined to report, even though the vast majority of sexual assaults remain unreported.
So in those kinds of cases, especially, and you mentioned the horrible video footage of that murder, you've seen some of the worst things people do to each other. How does that affect you personally?
That's a really good question. I would say sometimes it can really be depressing. I mean, there's no other way to say it. But the goal is justice. And when one of these cases is resolved and a guilty person, maybe who's killed an innocent person or who has victimized a child, is sentenced to time in prison and removed from the community where they can no longer hurt anyone, that is personally satisfying to me. Justice is great, and to get to justice, you have to tell the truth, and that's what a news organization like ours is about.
Do you believe in evil? Do you think there are evil people out there?
Well, sometimes it certainly does seem that way. There just doesn't seem to be any explanation for some of the horrible things that people do. But gosh, I'm probably not qualified to determine whether or not evil exists,
mm-hmm.
But it sure does seem like it's there sometimes.
Talk about some of the crime victims you've encountered and gotten to know. Do you form relationships with them?
I do. It's a really interesting thing. I mean, sometimes these families of a murder victim, for example, I know it is so difficult for them when they read the account of what happened to their loved one in the media, not just once, but multiple times, maybe, when there's an arrest and then when there's an indictment or a formal information filed charging them with the crime, and then they start going to court, and then we have a trial. And that's a lot of coverage. And I think that for some of these people, victims of sexual assault and family members of murder victims, it's very difficult to just be barraged with that. And they have to make a choice not to read it sometimes. I've had some tell me I just don't do it. But they also appreciate that there is, attention being paid to the case. I do get to know a lot of them. I try very hard, especially in the case of, let's say, a murder victim, to not only write about the offender and what they've done and what's happening to them, but to get a perspective from the family about who was this person that's no longer with us and, has been taken from them. We try to cover the whole picture. Sexual assault victims, there are some that I have gotten to know extremely well. I became acquainted, I don't want to really use any names. Obviously, we don't publish the names of sexual assault victims unless they specifically request that we do so. There have been a couple, one a man and one a woman, in totally unrelated cases, who have asked that their names be used. And both of those people, after seeing their cases, against their offenders go through the criminal justice system, later took steps to not be victims anymore, but rather survivors and advocates. I'm thinking specifically of a local doctor who got the law changed in Arkansas to remove the statute of limitations on child sex crimes, because oftentimes I think it used to be about, early 20s, you had to report something that happened to you when you were a minor. And a lot of people aren't ready to do that until they're into their 30s or later. And of course, that makes those cases extremely difficult to prove and prosecute, but it gives victims the opportunity to be heard regardless of when they are ready to tell their story. I've seen another victim do the same thing, go from victim to survivor to advocate, and get a law changed in the state of Arkansas where a victim can request that their attacker be tested for HIV. It used to have to be done more administratively through the prosecuting attorney's office, and now a victim, his or herself, can make that request because of the actions of a rape victim whose case was prosecuted here in Miller County, Arkansas.
What's on your radar screen as we head into the end of the year and the beginning of the year? You mentioned that fetal abduction case. Why don't you sort of recap that for people?
Sure. Taylor Renee Parker, a.k.a. Taylor Morton, I believe she's also used some other last names. She is accused of attacking a woman in New Boston at her home who was, very close to her due date. She murdered the mother, allegedly, and then removed the infant from her womb and attempted to cross into Oklahoma, and I think her plan was to try to pass this child off as her own. That case has been filed as capital murder. There's multiple charges also of kidnapping and some other things, but she is scheduled to go on trial next year for capital murder of the mother, and she faces the death penalty. That is on the table. The state is going to be asking a jury for a death sentence in that case should they convict her of capital murder. It's the most unusual case I think I've ever covered. And I've done a lot of research. Fetal abductions are incredibly rare. I would say in the last 20 years, maybe less than 100 or, somewhere around there have been documented in the United States. It's just a really unusual crime, but it seems to be increasing. One article that I read in, I believe, The Guardian talked about how there's been an increase in those crimes since there's been so much better security in hospital wards now, in maternity wards and nurseries in hospitals. You can't easily steal an infant from a hospital. So I guess people who are motivated to take another person's baby are looking at other ways of doing it. I don't know. I certainly can't delve into the psychology of that. I'm not qualified, but just sort of the statistics bear that out.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Well, there's always so much going on. I often tell people I can't remember what I wrote about yesterday, but I'm thinking
You do often file multiple stories a day.
that is true because I cover many, many different courts. I'm covering federal courts in both Texas and Arkansas, state courts in both Texas and Arkansas, and there are quite a few of them. And then, of course, we've got a really good defense bar here in Texarkana. We have a lot of really highly qualified and accomplished civil attorneys. It's difficult for me sometimes to just pull them out of my head, but there is never a shortage of things going on in the legal community around here.
Well, people can read all about it in the Gazette, and thanks again for taking a little time to catch us up on who you are and what you do, just in case there's someone out there who never heard of Lynn LaRowe.
I'm sure there's plenty.
Well, we'll be looking for your stories in the Gazette. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye. On the Line is a Texarkana Gazette podcast recorded in Star Bear Studio, right here in downtown Texarkana, USA. The show was written, produced, and edited by Karl Richter. News stories are based on Gazette staff reports. Texarkana Gazette podcasts are made possible in part by a grant from the Google News Initiative Journalism Emergency Relief Fund. I'll see you next week on the line.